Good morning. Good morning. My name is Chantal Jonge-Artat, and I'm the president of Women in International Security, also known as WISE. And I'd like to welcome you on this bright Monday morning to this third roundtable in a series of five that is devoted to women, terrorism, and violent extremism. This is a series that is supported by the Embassy of Liechtenstein. And unfortunately, Ambassador Fritsche, who was supposed to be here this morning, wasn't able to be with us because her plane got cancelled yesterday, and she sends her regrets. But Ambassador Fritsche has been extremely supportive of this particular program, but also more generally of the 1325 agenda and promoting the role of women in international peace and security issues. And the objective of these roundtables is really to try to bridge the gap between, on the one hand, the women, peace, and security community, and on the other, the security and counterterrorism community. Uh, our first roundtable looked more generally at those gaps and missing links in terms of how we define terrorism and violent extremism, and also noted the lack of really gendered analysis in this arena. Our second roundtable focused on the gender dynamics of recruitment and radicalization. And this roundtable will focus more specifically on our policy responses and programming. And we have a terrific panel here. And I would like to thank the panelists for taking the time this Monday morning to join us. We also have a terrific moderator in Jeanette Haney, who is Senior Fellow at WISE and a graduate of the US Naval Academy. Jeanette Haney is also a lieutenant colonel in the US Marines and a Cobra tech helicopter, which I find. Jeanette is very steeped in this issue. She is a PhD candidate at George Washington University, and her PhD focuses on the issue of gender equality and terrorism. So, panelists, you could not have a better moderator and a person to guide this discussion than Jeanette. So, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to you and hand it over to you, Jeanette.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. I guess that's like a double negative, right? If you can't hear me, you won't answer. So thank you all for being here. Again, I echo Chantal's remarks. I'm really excited to hear how this goes. So what we're going to do this morning is each panelist will take about 5 to 10 minutes to give some introductory comments. And then we're going to start a discussion where we kind of go chronologically through historical programming, successes and failures, inclusion of gender or lack thereof, and the change from CT towards CVE, and what that entails for us as far as policy responses. And we should complete with about hopefully 20 to 30 minutes of audience questions for the panelists. This is a pretty informal discussion, so I'm going to be directing questions in certain areas, but by all means, jump in where you think you want to. And for audience members, we really encourage questions towards the end. So this should be more of a discussion versus a lecture. We will also take a break halfway through for those of you who have taken caffeine this morning. Okay. So first of all, let me introduce the panelists. Susan Markham is directly to my right here, and she is the Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment at USAID. She has a very extensive and impressive background working women's issues, working women's political empowerment. She's recently served as Director of Women's Political Participation at the National Democratic Institute, served as Director of Emily's List Campaign Corps Program and the Political Opportunity Program to support female candidates for political office, and has worked in politics for years. I believe you got your start in Ohio, right? And that's fascinating, and I'd love to hear more about that at some point, but she can talk a lot about gender issues for us today. To her right is Tricia Ripley, who is the CVE, Senior CVE Officer at the National Counterterrorism Center right now. She currently helps integrate U.S. efforts to prevent and counter violent extremism. and works to implement the White House domestic CVE strategy. She's got 15 years, right, of experience working in the U.S. On issues like this. She facilitates dialogue by doing exercises with other nations to encourage dialogue and to build rapport with other countries, local governments, community groups, faith leaders, private sector, and others. She's also the co-founder and co-chair of the Women's Council for the U.S. Office of Director of National Intelligence, which champions women's voices across the U.S. foreign policy community. So thank you, Trisha. Irfan Saeed is to her right, and he is currently the director for CVE at the State's Bureau of Counterterrorism, leading strategy and policy formation and development for the U.S. international CVE efforts. I've got a question about this one more because it seemed very interesting in your bio, but the development of the Community Engagement Office in the U.S. Embassy in Pakistan, which was apparently first of its kind. That sounds very interesting. I'd like to hear about that. He's also been coordinator of CVE activities at the director of Department of Homeland Security as a senior policy advisor, and worked as a criminal prosecutor at the state and federal levels in Louisiana and in 88 in New Orleans, correct? I was born and raised in New Orleans. It's a great place. Did you really? I saw Harry Connick Jr. in concert Friday.
Let's talk about that next hour.
Yeah. We can talk about that after. It was Wolf Trap. It was a great concert. Okay, so I digress. And at the end there is Pamela Faber, who is a CNA senior analyst right now, and she works at the CNA Center for Stability and Development, specializing in the intersection of security and development and conflict and post-conflict regions, and her area of expertise is Africa. Some of her recent work, she's conducted a Libyan conflict assessment, advised leaders on counter LRA strategy, and analyzed U.S. response options for different regions around Africa. She's also analyzed natural resource industries and emerging markets for two political risk consultancies, and conducted fieldwork in the DRC in 2014 for about, you said, 3 to 4 months. And studied the impact of international transparency initiatives on mining and local development there. So without much more here, I'll turn it over to our panelists. We would please say about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll start going through our questions.
All important water. Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Jeanette and Wise, for putting this series of roundtables together. I feel like we have these conversations and we're just scratching the surface of so many of the issues, and so it's always nice to come together and hear from people who have great experience. I actually want to cut my remarks short so I can hear more from them, because it's just this topic that gets mentioned a lot and referenced, but really understanding the complexity of it, I think the more we learn, the more we need to continue to learn even more about it. So I'm going to talk briefly about USAID and the work that we're doing around countering violent extremism from the gender perspective. The role of senior gender coordinator, which I hold, is new under this administration. And so we are working to integrate issues of gender across the whole portfolio at USAID and really make it core to the business of USAID. In this field specifically, we're trying to gather a lot of knowledge. Of course, across the whole CVE sector, we're gaining a lot of knowledge, but specifically on gender. And this year, we are investing a lot in different areas of the world, in different regions. We have known at USAID that we believe that the development tools that we have across sectors, whether it's economic or social or political work that we do, are essential to preventing and countering violent extremism. And really on the prevention side, we might turn to our state colleagues and others on the back end, but if we can work from the beginning, creating strong, democratic, resilient societies, that we think it will lead to greater security and prosperity. And we actually had a policy that came out before the gender policy, which came out in 2011, called the Development Response to Violent Extremism and Insurgency. And it upfront recognized the importance of identifying and addressing the drivers of violent extremism, and noted that much of the U.S. foreign assistance goes to countries in the midst of conflict or trying to prevent state failure. So we started working years ago to manage programs to address the drivers of violent extremism in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So we start these programs by doing rigorous, locally informed risk assessments and the analysis of these, because we really see that they're different in all of these places. And then we can go from there to design programs that concentrate in areas where we think they're most effective. We do youth empowerment, social and economic inclusion. We work a lot with reliable media and improved local governance, in some cases in reconciliation and conflict mitigation. So we look across a range of different interventions, but then we try to be very specific and target distinct populations. And I have to say, many of the early programs at USAID, we did focus on at-risk young men. It was the first coming to mind, and in the risk assessments, we saw them needing a greater need. But now we are increasingly recognizing the unique role of women in promoting peace and security in some of our prevention efforts. So as we've had these programs over several years, we have invested significant resources to monitoring and evaluating these programs. And we collect both qualitative and quantitative data to see what lessons we can learn. And we are looking across as the different roles that women can play. Oftentimes, I think we lean towards kind of the protective aspect of women, but as we have collected this data, we have interest and a growing awareness around the non-traditional roles that women can play, including as fighters, recruiters, perpetrators, and facilitators. So these are not new, but we are being more specific about how we can work with women, the many women who are not being recruited to go, but are working every day in their communities on a range of these issues. So we are working, as I said before, on research with other parts of the US government, as well as the United States Institute for Peace, the Department of Defense, and state, as I said before, really looking at this research. We're looking at stereotypes and dichotomies that exist. And I should say that this is true for men and women. This is part of, as we are catching up on CVE and looking at the gender policy at USAID, we don't say specifically women, we're looking at the gender roles, because what we found is that the gender roles of men and the gender roles of women are equally important. And when men, the pressure to get married, have a job, be able to support their family, when some of those issues are kind of leading to some of their dissatisfaction with their life or their inability of government to respond, that's the actual gender roles that we need to address, in addition to kind of the traditional gender roles of women as a peacekeeper and a homemaker and that sort of thing. So we know that there's no magic intervention, and so the programs that we have across countries are very different. In some places like Mali, we're looking at capacity building of women and youth to prevent radicalization. We work with a community of practice for civil society organizations who work in these. In other places like Pakistan, which was previously mentioned, we work with governments to help improve their response to citizen needs. Because sometimes we found that I did a lot of work with young women in politics, but when you get citizens really engaged and they go out and they reach out to their government and they want better services and they want more rights, and then their government cannot respond, that can also kind of create a culture where young men and women are feel the need to respond to not being heard. So I'll just close out because just last month, the USAID and the Department of State put out our strategy on countering violent extremism. And we worked hard to make sure that, although it's not a gender document, that we made sure that gender issues were integrated throughout that document as we move forward with the work that we're doing together. So the 5 objectives of the strategy are to expand international political will, partnerships and expertise to better understand the drivers of violent extremism, encourage and assist partner governments, as I just referenced, to adopt more effective policies and approaches, employ foreign assistance tools and approaches, including development assistance to reduce specific political, economic, and social factors, empower and amplify locally credible voices that can change the perception of violent extremist groups, and strengthen the capacity and the capabilities of government and non-governmental actors to isolate, intervene with, and promote the rehabilitation and reintegration of individuals who are caught in the cycle. So I'm just going to leave it there and look forward to questions.
Everyone here okay? It's like tall. So my name is Trisha Ripley, and I am from the National Counterterrorism Center, or NCTC, And just by way of background, so NCTC was created in 2004 as a result of the 9/11 Commission recommendations to bridge more of the domestic and the foreign counterterrorism information. So some of the failures of September 11th found that information sharing was an issue between the overseas and domestic. So our mandate is to sort of bridge that, and we write for senior policymakers in the executive branch with a primary focus on counterterrorism. We have a number of directorates, our largest being our Directorate of Intelligence. So that's organized regionally and functionally. And I would say the area that probably touches closest on gender specific would be our radicalization and extremist messaging group within our DI. And so they look at sort of the radicalization and recruitment trends, some of the root causes, underpinnings of this sort of trend. But we were really started early 2000s as a result of 9/11 with a very focus on Al-Qaeda and disruption and sort of connecting the rest of the dots that had been missed that day, and really large scale plotting that was going on in the early 2000s. So that's sort of our backdrop. I'm in our Directorate of Strategic Operational Planning, so it's the policy side, and we're also organized regionally. And within that, I'm in our Homeland group, and we and focus solely on domestic CVE, so domestic counter-violent extremism. So the idea of it is really getting into the prevention space, realizing that we can't arrest our way out of this problem set, that we need to be building resilient society. So we do a whole range of kind of programming and support to communities and other governments, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. But in terms of the issue of gender and women and terrorism as a phenomenon, this isn't a necessarily new phenomenon that we've seen over the past few years, although it has been on the rise. From the years of 2008 to 2013, we only had 5 arrests in the United States out of 115 connected to foreign terrorist organizations in the U.S., so 5 out of 115. So this is in stark contrast to in the past 2 years, we've had 10 out of 71. So a dramatic increase, and we see women playing a number of different roles within the organization. Some traveled over to join their spouses and their boyfriends or to find partners. Some were recruited to join all-female brigades, such as the Al-Qanza Brigade, which is a women-only religious police and enforcement. And, and we've seen women recruiting other women. So there's really no one-size-fits-all in terms of trend for this. We've seen, especially here in the West, social media being used as recruitment techniques, and really, targeting the 15 to 23, say, age demographic here, using, slogans that look like Nike, just do it, saying, jihad, rise to it. We've seen slogans specifically targeting women, like till martyrdom do us part, with a picture of a bride with her husband over there. But all too often we see women, sold into slavery, trafficked, and we use terms when we brief our community partners like luring and grooming, because that's really how the recruitment mechanism starts. They start on open social media platforms, and then, engaging very benignly in a conversation about the Middle East, about events in Syria, and then the individual on the other end overseas will tell them to switch to an encrypted platform, and there we really lose all coverage. And then the individuals telling them not to go publicly and talk to anyone about their conversion and their beliefs, and so it's really a luring and grooming, almost like a pedophile uses. In terms of recruitment themes of what we're seeing, there's really not a huge difference between our male and female recruits. So there's like 4 main themes I would say we've seen in terms of U.S. recruits to ISIS. So one being humanitarian concerns, so especially in the early days of the Syrian civil war, focusing on the plight of Syrians under the Assad regime and the general suffering of communities around the world and Muslim communities around the world. So they're focusing really on the civilian casualties, Western military action, although often they're embellishing some of the remarks. we see anti-Islamic sentiment and Islamophobia featured in ISIS propaganda. So, using public statements by officials here in the United States and in Europe, or actual physical attacks on individuals or Muslim institutions in the West to prove the claim that the West is against Islam. We see the state building narrative featured, so the idea that you can be part of this legitimate caliphate, that we're different than Al Qaeda. We've established this caliphate. We have religious legitimacy. So it's really focusing on, here you too can be part of building this new state. They'll make claims saying, come join us. You can be a teacher. You can be a nurse. You can be a doctor. Look at the great kind of efforts we have in distributing food to the needy, taking care of orphans, and other state-like activities. And I think that is a very much targeting some of the female recruits. We just see women featured in those videos specifically. And then just the sense of adventure and empowerment. So really targeting that individualistic kind of Western mentality that you can be part of adventure, you can fight and be a hero, and support this kind of personal adventure role. And we've seen really a broad swath of individuals from the West. There's really no one profile, no one demographic. So individuals like Jalen Young, who is 19 years old and from Vicksburg, Mississippi. She's the daughter of a police officer in Mississippi, was a member of her cheerleading squad and homecoming court, was a student in Mississippi studying chemistry in college, and she offered up her services to the Islamic State and to serve as a medic, and basically tried to travel over there under the guise of her honeymoon, and fortunately was stopped before she could depart. Then we have individuals like Ariel Bradley, who is 30 years old. And I should say Jalen is facing up to 20 years in prison as a result of those efforts. Ariel Bradley is 30 years old from Chattanooga, Tennessee. She grew up in an evangelical family, ran away from home, and kind of bounced from religion to religion and from relationship to relationship. She started chatting via WhatsApp, a social media app, with a fighter who was Swedish, and basically ended up moving over to Sweden, married him, and then she, with her two children, ended up in Syria, and she's over there now tweeting and Instagramming from the conflict zone. And then individuals like Hoda Mothanov from Alabama, who is 20 years old and is the youngest daughter of a five-child family who are parents are Yemeni Americans and came here through the refugee process. She started a secret Twitter account in 2013, started communicating with fighters over there, and began isolating herself from her community and her family and her friends. She started withdrawing her tuition checks from college and used that money to pay for her plane ticket over Syria. And so she's over there now, also very live on media. So really a range of spectrum of really great students, people with great families, and not so really just not one size fits all. In terms of things that we're doing about this, so I would say it's a luxury to think of doing gender specific actions right now. A lot of the CT community is really just on responding and connecting dots and figuring out plotting and individuals. In terms of CVE, we do a lot of community briefings to educators, to religious leaders across the U.S., to law enforcement at the local, state, and federal level. We do community resilience exercises, so we take a city and its surrounding counties, and we go through the exercise as though usually a minor is radicalizing. We have about 60 people in the room. It's an all-day tabletop exercise. Half the room is law enforcement from the city, state, local level. The other half of the room are educators, mental health workers, public health providers, school psychologists, religious leaders, teachers, parents, and we go through the exercise, and it comes with various scenes, and we break apart and and talk about, as the individuals engaging in, looking at violent content online, what do we do at this part? Who has the lead in terms of, does the school have responsibility? Has anything illegal happened? So the idea is that they're not meeting for the first time during an Orlando or a San Bernardino. But unfortunately, we're spread very thin and more focused, I would say, on the reaction than the prevention efforts. So I will pass it along, and happy to talk about other issues specifically. That's sort of just the general scene setter, I guess. Mm-hmm.
All right, thanks. Good morning. Let me thank Wise and the Embassy of Liechtenstein for having us out here this morning and for this be on this very, very austere panel, if you will. A few years ago, I was at work watching martyrdom videos, which I'm prone to do, but only at work because my name is Irfan Saeed and I look like this, and I fly a lot. So I choose to only look at martyrdom videos at work. So anyway, I'm looking at these videos. It's about 2009 when we lost about 30 some odd kids from the Minneapolis, Minnesota area. They disappeared overnight. I mean, mothers literally woke up the next morning knocking on their sons' doors, waking them for work or school, and they're not there. And so we were trying to study what happened. How did these kids just pack up and leave and move to Somalia to join Al-Shabaab? And so in the aftermath, we're looking at some of these videos, and one of the kids is who ended up dying in Somalia. He made one of these videos, and he's looking into the camera, and he's railing. He's death and destruction, and you did this, and you brought this upon yourself. It's the very traditional things that we hear from these very angry young men. And I don't know if you've ever heard the term steely eyes, like his eyes were dead. These are the types of eyes that you see in these martyrdom videos. So as he's going on and on and on about, why he chose to go to Somalia, why he chose to go fight, he stops for a second. He looks off and he says, "Let me say something to my mother." And then he started to cry. And he started to see some of the life come back into his eyes. And he's trying to explain to his mother, this is not your fault. You had nothing to do with this. This is me. And he's trying to assure his mother that she was not to blame for his actions, for him going over to Somalia and end up losing his life. And it was that situation where you start to see the very, very powerful role that women can play in CVE. Because if we had had the mother just a few days earlier, a few weeks earlier, actually intervene, you could have maybe prevented this kid from going over to join Al-Shabaab in the first place. So when we talk about women in CVE, I think we have three very distinct roles, and Susan touched upon this, and I'll just explain a little bit about some of these roles. I think the first two roles, victims and perpetrators, we know pretty well. You heard from Susan, you heard from Tricia very particularly about some of the roles that women are playing as perpetrators and as victims. I think when you talk about victims, you have to look no further than 276 schoolgirls. I'm going to repeat that number. 276 schoolgirls kidnapped overnight by Boko Haram in Nigeria. Role of perpetrators. Last year, a quarter of all suicide bombers in Nigeria were perpetrated by young girls. The 3 London schoolgirls, you guys remember this last year? 3 girls left their school in London. Last you saw was still images of them in Heathrow Airport. I think you guys talk about this in the awareness briefing. You see still images of them going through Heathrow Airport. Again, parents have no clue where they are. They're missing persons. But through the investigation, you see that they went through Heathrow, they got on a plane, went over to Istanbul, and then in Istanbul, you see some still shots of them leaving the airport and then going over to a train station, getting on a train, heading south. Guess where they ended up? Exactly right. Now they're jihadi brides. 3 young schoolgirls, what ages? 14, 15, and 16. Tashfeen Malik, San Bernardino. And I think when you look at Orlando, we're still trying to figure out what the role the wife played there. Was she there? Was she complicit in buying ammo? Did she help with the recon? Did she go to Disney World to do some recon? Who knows? I think the investigation will bear that out. But I think when you look at the role of women as perpetrators, it's a long history of that. But I think the third role that we're really not focusing on, I think we're starting to do a better job of that, and that's why it's so important that we have these type of roundtables, is the role of women as CVE actors. I think if you look at the CVE summit process from last year, not only the big summit that the president hosted, but also all the regional summits that we had around the world leading into the Leaders Summit at UNGA, it really brought forth this issue of how can we get women in this role of gender to play a bigger role in as CVE actors. I mean, because who better than mothers and sisters to identify these indicators if their son or if their brother, their family are going through the signs of radicalization to violence? Who's going to notice? Is it going to be law enforcement? Is it going to be the imam? It's going to start at home. Who better than mothers to teach their kids that going out and building these communities of trust are absolutely essential in building this sort of resilience cocoon around their environment, around their kids. And finally, when you look at women like Malala Yousafzai, I say women, girls like Malala Yousafzai, who I had the good fortune to meet when she was about 13 years old. And when she was 13 and she's making these diaries to send off to BBC to explain that all she wants to do is go to school. The Taliban won't let her. It's a powerful, powerful actor. Or someone like Zareen Khan. I think you guys also talked about Zareen Khan in the awareness brief. Zareen Khan is the mother of Muhammad Hamza Khan, about 18 years old. It's a kid who was arrested in Chicago, trying to, basically radicalize his younger brother and sister, but took his brother with him to the airport to try and head off towards Syria. He was interdicted, he was arrested, and the mother just could not believe that her son would do this. So the day that her son pled guilty in federal court in Chicago, Zareen Khan, who's not a spokeswoman, been a stay-at-home mom, trying to raise her kids, she actually stands on the courthouse steps, federal courthouse in Chicago, all the cameras looking at her, and she looks into the camera and she says, "Mr. Baghdadi, I have a message for you," as tears are just strolling down her face. Leave our children alone. That powerful image alone is I think, proof of how powerful women can be in this role of CVE actors. So what are we doing about this? I think Susan touched upon some of the policies and practice. So let me highlight 3 areas that we're looking to expand here. Number one, when you talk about practice, you talk about projects like what Sisters Against Violent Extremism are doing. Dr. Edith Schlosser out in Europe, or Musarat Qadim at Paiman Trust in Pakistan. Musarat is working in villages outside of Peshawar to work with young kids to pull them away from this pathway of radicalization to violence. Or Dr. Edith Schlosser in Sisters Against Violent Extremism, who's working with mothers through these things called mothers' schools to teach them the signs of radicalization to violence, to teach them how to act. It's one thing to tell people this is what radicalization looks like. It's one thing to have an awareness brief where you're showing the narratives and you're showing the process of recruitment. But it's another thing to teach them how to act. Who's going to identify who will interact with this young kid? How do you identify who taps that person on the shoulder to say, "I think you need some help"? And what does that help look like? These are some of the programs that Musarat and Dr. Schlosser are working on around the world. If you look at places like East and West Africa, Nigeria and Kenya in particular, the State Department and CT Bureau, we have programs that are looking at women preventing violent extremism by having them work more closely with law enforcement to build these communities of trust that I talked about earlier. And also, you talk about this thing called broken dreams. Earlier, I mentioned that young kid from Minneapolis. Well, a lot of these mothers, you had 30 some odd mothers who wanted to do something. So the community got together and made a short form documentary called Broken Dreams. And this documentary, what it did was it talked to the women and got the stories. Tricia was telling you these case studies. You guys were all rapt with attention because it makes it real. These are real people. So to have these mothers tell their stories of their children who were students, who had left their comfortable beds to go join al-Shabaab in Somalia and have them come back dead, either killed on the battlefields or killed by al-Shabaab themselves, 2 bullets in the back of the head. Having these mothers tell their stories That's powerful. That's practice. But what about policy? Susan talked about this joint State Department USAID policy that we have, the new strategy. It came out just a few weeks ago. And she talked very specifically about those 5 strategic objectives. But let me just highlight some of those objectives and what we're doing to bring in the role of gender more closely into those 5 objectives. The first objective, in plain speak, is actually research, better understanding those global and localized drivers. How are we doing that? We're developing networks of researchers worldwide. And this network that we're developing is called Resolve, Researching Solutions to Violent Extremism. I encourage you to Google it. But generally, what Resolve is trying to do is basically understand those very, very, very localized drivers that are bringing people on this pathway of radicalization to violence. But it's also increasing the significance of the role of women in gender. How do we get women researchers into this space? And how do we get more research done and truly understanding what is the role that mothers can play in those 3 areas, as either victims, as actors, or as perpetrators? Second objective is prevention. How do we look at the environment that is breeding violent extremism? And you have to look no further than the gender-based violence that happens in places that actually have high instances of violent extremism, or honor killings, or gender equality, or the lack thereof. For those of you who haven't seen Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy's new documentary, take a look at it. When you talk about this issue of honor killing, it's this type of mentality that's breeding a lot of the environment that leads to violent extremism. The documentary is called A Girl in the River. It's a story about a woman who married by her choice, and her father and her uncle came to get her, shot her, beat her, threw her in the river. Luckily, she survived, and she survived to tell her story. Third objective is intervention. It's one thing to develop off-ramps and develop alternatives to prosecution. As Tricia talked about, there's a very CT response, and in some instances, a CT response is very good. You need that investigation, the arrest, the prosecution. You need to put people in jail. But there are many, many instances when you need to off-ramp people, get them alternatives so they don't go to jail. So part of the intervention process is not only that, but also getting better at the community policing module and actually getting women police officers to understand their role in building communities of trust. The fourth objective is counter-messaging. It's one thing to reach the reachables, but how do you reach the unreachables? And I would point to a new consortium that just formed, started by the Quilliam Foundation out of the UK, and they started this thing called Families Against Terrorism and Extremism, #FATE. And they're highlighting the role of families. What happens to families when a person goes off to fight? What's the damage that's done? What's the aftermath of that? And finally, rehabilitation, reintegration, that's the last objective. In a place like Pakistan, you have a lot of kids who are brought into this pathway of radicalization and violence. And the government of Pakistan has a school called Sabaun. And they put these kids in this school and they try to de-radicalize them. And they were having minimal success until a woman psychologist by the name of Fariha Paracha comes on board. And Fariha Paracha was able to actually get into the minds of these kids, get them to open up, and get them to explain to them very clearly what is this pathway of radicalization and violence and how do we solve it. So with that, I think when you look at the CVE action agenda that's been created last year and it's getting a lot of momentum, there's a real opportunity here for the peace, women, peace, and security community. We have an opportunity to reframe women's rights and roles as part of the larger security apparatus. So I think now is the time to actually take and build upon that. So with that, I'll turn it over and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you very much to Wise and Jeanette and the rest of the esteemed panelists. It's a great honor to be here. All of these points are so fantastic that I also will try to keep my comments brief so we could actually discuss them and hopefully not be too repetitive. But just to introduce myself again, my name's Pamela, and I'm an analyst at the Center for Stability and Development. We examine strategic, regional, and policy issues in conflict and post-conflict regions. And my background specifically is in the intersection of conflict, security, and development with a specific focus on the natural resource industry in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So for these brief remarks, I want to focus on three ways, three angles, three lenses, both from an analytical and a contextual framework, focusing on examples of Africa, of how to look at the issue of women and violent extremism. I'll go through each one, but they are, first of all, the importance of incorporating an analytical framework of counterterrorism theories into an assessment framework of counterterrorism and counterviolent extremism action. And I think that this is something that we need to get better at. Second, understanding, and other people have touched on this a bit, but understanding the multifaceted role that women play in violent extremist organizations. And I'm going to focus a little bit on Boko Haram and some examples there, the violent extremist organization that I've mentioned. And third, ensuring that there is clarity across agencies. There's a lot of interagency work that's fantastic, but ensuring that there's clarity across agencies about what the role of the US is in actually enacting some of these initiatives. And that's particularly important in a sort of post-colonial, often post-Civil War context in Africa. The importance of assessments. So as we're all aware, in the US, in the post 9/11 environment, a lot of money has gone toward counterterrorism. A lot of money has gone toward counter-extremism. Until recently, not as much emphasis has been placed on a rigorous and useful assessment framework of all of these counterterrorism and counterviolent extremism actions. And as a result of this, the question of why terrorism occurs, so the why, the how it occurs, the actions that are carried out by different violent extremists and terrorist groups, and the what to measure, so the metrics of how you see whether these groups are actually successful and also whether those combating the groups are successful. These are not necessarily being analytically linked. And CNA recently did a report on this that argued that the most important thing is to ensure, one way to get around this is to ensure that a theory of terrorism is chosen from the outset, that counterterrorism programming can be chosen as a result of that theory, and then appropriate questions can be asked and indicators can be collected in order to measure these results. And so in other words, approaches should be based on theory and assessments should be based on those approaches. And there are lots of I won't get into all of them now, but there are varied theories that I'm sure that we are all familiar with. There's the ideology theory that its most recent incarnation has been jihadism, where ideology is a driver for these actions. There's the root causes theory, which, as I have a background in development, I enjoy that theory, and that theory is often used in a lot of development work, and it focuses on the idea that there are long-held historical grievances, political, social, economic issues that must be addressed, that are drivers, and yes, there's also sort of top-down influences, but really, essentially, this stuff emerges from local issues. There's the state sponsorship theory, that in reality, while terrorism and violent extremism is often seen as transnational, there is a lot of state sponsorship that needs to be considered. There's rational choice, and there's group dynamics. Essentially, that the terrorism is, despite the fact that what we've been seeing and the narratives that we've been seeing about lone wolf activity, extremism is an inherently social activity. Mobilization is social, radicalization is social. And so these are some of the theories that, if chosen from the outset, it is easier and it is more effective to therefore choose indicators that you can measure to see if programs are actually being successful. To move on, and others have touched on this, so I'll just talk about it briefly, and Elizabeth Pearson, a researcher out of the UK, has done a lot of work on women in Boko Haram, and I would recommend that you look into some of her work if you're interested in it. But the varied experiences of women in the world of violent extremism is very well demonstrated by Boko Haram. And gender-based violence has become an increasingly significant component of Boko Haram tactics over time. And for those of you who may not be familiar, Boko Haram is a violent extremist organization that operates primarily in northern Nigeria. And it's been around since about 2002, but it really radicalized and changed forms in 2009 after the Nigerian government was able to kill their leader, Muhammad Yusuf, and he was replaced by Abubakar Shekau. And Shekau really more closely aligned Boko Haram's aims with Al-Qaeda and radicalized the group. So Boko Haram has used gender-specific tactics, and those gender-specific tactics have evolved over time with the evolution of the group itself. are probably most familiar, and the other panelists have mentioned, the Chibok girls. And so the abduction of over 270 schoolgirls, primarily Christian schoolgirls. And that happened 2 years ago. But Boko Haram has been using abductions as a tactic since 2012, since earlier than that. And they've been using abductions as both an instrumental, tactical, and retributive purpose. For all of these reasons, they've been using it. Initially, they began to use abductions actually as a response to the Nigerian government's tactics of abducting the wives of Boko Haram members. And so if you follow the video statements of Shekau over the 2012-2013 period, you see him explicitly stating that Boko Haram is going to begin using the tactic of abducting women as a response to the Nigerian government's tactics. And so you can see a clear evolution of this messaging. But it has since evolved, and since 2005, Boko Haram has used, it's in the hundreds, I think it's close to 250 or 300 now, female suicide bombers. And this is extremely unique and extremely interesting. The research shows that female suicide bombers are usually, on average, used after about 13 years of fighting by a rebel group. And that has been used to argue that it's actually a sign of desperation. And so when you start to use female suicide bombers, essentially the male fighting force is depleted, and so you're using female suicide bombers. If we view Boko Haram as really reemerging in 2009, this doesn't really fit, and there's a strong argument to say that their use of female suicide bombers is actually not a sign of desperation, but a sign of strength and a sign of evolution of tactics. And not only does it give them a tactical advantage, but it also, and this is extremely significant from sort of an ideological and analytical standpoint, it reflects their shift in allegiance from Al-Qaeda to ISIL. And we can debate about how much this allegiance actually means in practice, but in reality, Al-Qaeda is a more conservative with a small c, meaning that they do not condone the use of a female fighting force necessarily and female suicide bombers. Whereas ISIL would be more seen as a radical force, and they have condoned the use of women being in this role. And so these tactics reflect this sort of shift in allegiance, and it really shows the instrumental role that women play in representing also the ideology of a group. Finally, I just wanted to briefly touch on perhaps, and I'm sure the other panelists have much more experience in this than I do, but the tension that may be inherent in some U.S. policies and programs on the goals and the goals of countering violent extremism and the role of the U.S. specifically in these goals. And as I said, this is extremely important because context matters, and in Africa, this really does matter. There's an example with the Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Partnership, which emerged in 2011 after the Arab Spring. It is an evolution of the Pan-Sahel Initiative. The purpose of the program is to counter violent extremism in pockets of insecurity and lack of governance after the fall of sort of strong men in the region, so Mubarak and Gaddafi, et cetera. And it's an interagency initiative, USAID, state, DOD, DOJ. And there's an argument that there was a lack of clarity in certain countries about the difference between deterring a group and defeating a group. And this is extremely significant because it will insinuate and lead to different policy prescriptions. And so deterring a group essentially means, could mean isolating, could mean surrounding, could mean a number of things that are usually by, with, and through. And so the Department of Defense would call it by, with, and through, which essentially means that the U.S. would take more of a secondary role, more of a training role, behind-the-scenes role. Whereas defeating may insinuate more of sort of a kinetic, more of a militarily active role, a much more diverse portfolio of strategies, and perhaps boots on the ground. And so, and these, it may seem like a small point, but when you have this interagency dialogue, you need to be extremely clear on these varied things. And so I'm happy to answer any questions about any of those, and I'll close with that.
Okay, thank you all. So we are going to push forward. What I'd like to do is do a brief talk about the historical development of programs and how those changed over time, probably leading up to about 9/11. So Irfan, I'm going to start with you because of your background. You've got quite an extensive and impressive record of studying counterterrorism and developing and implementing policy responses for it. Can you give us a talk for a few minutes about the history of CT and eventually CVE programming?
Sure. You mentioned my background. People find it quite surprising that a counterterrorism prosecutor, someone who's used to putting people in jail, is actually in the CVE space. But I would argue it's the reason why I'm in the CVE space is because I spend so much time putting people in jail. And I'll tell you, we started to see a very strong evolution of the type of people we were encountering. So, pre 9/11, 9/11, and the very, very few months and years after 9/11, the people that we were investigating and prosecuting were what we called hardcore ideologues. These were Al Qaeda terrorists. These are people that would, stop at nothing to perpetrate acts of violence in the United States and against our allies and partners around the world. So when you brought them to court, they had that same sort of steely eyes that I talked about earlier. You would stand there, you would read the list of charges, and you would say, Your Honor, the maximum term of imprisonment this person is facing is 20 years in prison, a $250,000 fine, blah, blah, blah. And they look at you like no big deal. They take the hit. Hey, look, if you want to work this out, why don't you talk to us? Maybe we can flip you. Maybe we can, get some information and we can lessen your charge. Screw you. Okay. Goes to jail for 20 years. And this happened case after case after case. You fast forward a couple of years, 2005, 2006, 2007, you started to see a different type of terrorist. And I'll tell you a quick story. We got a guy who took a bag, a Ziploc bag, put white powder in there, wrote "Anthrax, die Americans," threw it into a post office, which made it a federal crime. So, as a federal prosecutor, we arrest this guy, bring him into court. It was actually talcum powder. He's trying to scare people. He was actually a violent white supremacist, actually. But it was symptomatic of the type of people we were seeing. We arrested him. We bring him to court, faces the judge, 18 years old, looked like he's about 12. And I said, the maximum term of imprisonment you're facing is 20 years in prison. He starts crying like a baby, hits the ground, fetal position. No steely eyes there on that guy. So what you started to see is the beginning of a different type of terrorist. Younger, not ideologues. This kid just got caught up in the sort of wrong party, wrong group of friends. And then, and Trish can tell you this with all the case studies they've done recently, all of the sort of Al-Shabaab, ACAP, and into the ISIL recruits, they were trending younger and younger and younger. And you started to notice, as you were putting him in jail, that if someone had just gotten to this kid last year, 6 months ago, before he really turned, his life could have turned out very different. And that's where we started to really look at off-ramps to prosecution. But at the Department of Justice at the time, there were no off-ramps. When I was judged by how many people I brought to court, how many cases I indicted, and how many people I put in jail, not how many cases I interdicted, how many people I turned away from terrorism. That wasn't a barometer in that respect. So I think sort of around 2007, 2008, you started to see a shift in the United States, not only from the Department of Justice, but from the Department of Homeland Security and NCTC and FBI, that maybe there should be more. Leading into the 2011 National Strategy on CVE, empowering local partners to prevent violent extremism in the United States. Feel free to Google that too. There's I think a greater understanding that the ideologues, although they're there, they're not as strong as we think they are. It's these young, vulnerable kids, and that's where I think the CVE space really comes to fore. If we can just get in there in an earlier phase, we can prevent, we can intervene.
That helps. And Trisha, kind of follow up on that, and anyone feel free to jump in as well. So I know the NCTC didn't get stood up till 2004, but did you guys track historical successes and failures of programs originally, like from the decade prior? And if so, did you see any trends? Was there any attention given to what we had done in earlier years, and was gender a part of it at all?
I mean, I think in the early days it was so reactionary. It was such a fast-paced environment because of the threat and the scale of plotting with attacks in Madrid and London and the transatlantic plot, and it was just sort of go. I would say to the extent that we looked at some of the lessons learned in terms of working with defectors in other conflict zones in Germany and Italy, in the Irish Republican Army in the UK. So, but a lot was really just kind of getting the legal and bureaucratic impediments to information sharing. It's a very tactical between FBI, CIA, NSA, between kind of all the intelligence communities. And then kind of tracking with what Irfan was saying, we sort of saw this morphing of the world from a very sort of AFPAC central threat to then kind of this sort of, I would say, metastasis of Al Qaeda franchises in Yemen and Somalia and North Africa, and just sort of kind of a diversification of the threat picture. And it became a little more fluid. And then, after we lost a number of regimes in post-Arab Spring, it kind of flipped a lot of the world on its head, and a lot of our conventional CT partners were lost, or we saw the rise of groups like Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, and groups in Egypt and the Sinai. And as that kind of morphed, and as technology and social media sort of proliferated, then we saw what eventually culminated into ISIS. So we've kind of been probably a little bit behind the curve always in terms of how the threat has projected, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay. And as far as gender, and this might be good for you, Susan, the obviously we hear a lot about gender now, and it comes up constantly in discussions like these. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of gender being included in foreign policy, especially with CT and CVE, from your perspective and from USAID's?
Well, I think it's been touched on by several of us, as we have, and also in my opening remarks, when we looked initially at countering violent extremism programs, when we looked at the most at risk, we were looking at young men around the world. And so we kind of built a lot of programs, whether it was helping them find jobs, helping them connect with their communities, kind of supporting each other and remaining connected to other people. We were really focusing on young men. So, but then we became, I think, more aware of the three roles that women could play. Obviously, the headlines are often the victims. But this whole, just because of the gendered roles that women play in their lives, as the mothers or sisters or daughters, or in civil society as peacemakers, what knowledge, what services, what sort of unique characteristics do women bring to all of these? And so, as I said before, it's very specific to that context where it's most appropriate. I love the mothers groups, the mothers schools, where we're trying to help women who very much want to see what they can do in their own lives, not just with their own children, but their children's friends. And really, because they are taken aback. They wake up in the morning, their children are not there. They did not see it coming at all. And so, what they can do, oftentimes not understanding the internet. My children get new apps all the time that I'm constantly just trying to keep up with all the new technologies that they're using. And so, in that bigger space, really look at that. I have to say, with the women, peace, and security community that we've had, it's been an interesting conversation, because for me, I thought, oh my gosh, for so long, women, peace, and security has been kind of a theoretical on the side of the peace process. This is a way to move women, peace, and security into more of the security, into the countering violent extremism. And we've really had a mixed reaction. Some groups are very anxious to get involved in the more of the prevention. Others are nervous about becoming a counterterrorism organization and what that means for their security, for their funding, and their relationships as well. So we continue to have those conversations, but it's the assumption that we had that we could just rush in and there were all these willing partners out there has been not quite as smooth as we thought it was going to be. And once again reminds us that we really need to have specific conversations about the context, the country, where they are in the process as well.
Okay. And Pamela, you talked a bit about the 3 steps that should go into CVE, specifically in Africa, from your background. The first of those you mentioned is a baseline conflict analysis. Can you talk a little bit about what that entails and how CNA generally does them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have, so we've done a lot of these types of conflict assessments. Perhaps I'll share a few thoughts on the one on Boko Haram. We're also doing one on Libya. So there are different tools that you can use in order to understand what a conflict is. And you obviously don't want to be caught up in any specific narrative, but the definitions are important. And so one way to do it is to look at a conflict diagnosis, to diagnose the type of conflict that is happening. And by diagnosis, I mean, so you look at Boko Haram, you see a group that has been called a rebel group, has been called a violent extremist organization, has been called an Islamic terrorist group, and you might be wondering, so what are these groups aim? What is the important component of the aims of this group? How do we counter this group if we don't know exactly what they are and what they're doing? And so one way to look at that is to consider whether or not the group is an insurgency, to consider whether or not the group is a terrorist organization. Is it a civil war? Is it a more banditry? Is it a criminal organization? Based on how you define what the group is, you determine certain actions that you then take against that group. And of course, you have the risk of being wrong, which is why you need to do analysis and determine what this group actually is. So in the context of Boko Haram, there have been long-standing north-south grievances in Nigeria. There has a fairly disenfranchised primary Muslim north, a fairly developed primary Christian south. You have a government that hasn't always been effective in any sort of real integration, in allegations of corruption, primarily with the former administration, and now Buhari's sort of run on an anti-corruption campaign, etc. Things are changing, but in reality, looking at determining what the grievances of Boko Haram are, determining how they function, the tactics that they use, what is their end goal. Looking at all these things together, CNA did a conflict assessment that determined that in reality, it is an insurgency, and it's an insurgency because it's based primarily on local grievances. And yes, things may have shifted and this was done a few years ago, so these are things that should be done over time because they obviously shift. The allegiance to ISIL, does that change things? Arguably, perhaps not. Arguably, their grievances are still local, and by saying that they want to form an Islamic State in Nigeria, that might just be a tactic. It may not be their actual goals, but in reality, they most sort of align with an insurgency, and they also align, and it's also extremely important to remember that there is not one side to the fight there. So Nigeria has taken, in the past at least, an extremely heavy-handed approach countering insurgency, to countering Boko Haram. And what this means is that there's a large amount of civilian casualties, there's a large amount of reclamations on both sides. And so you also have to look at it as a failure of institutional mechanisms to counter this over time. And so you have to look at it from the side of the grievances and the insurgency and the lack of institutional mechanisms. And so if you want to then say, okay, so now we have this diagnosis, what do we do with it? Well, you have to sort of attack it from both angles. And you need, ideally, full security sector reform, but that isn't necessarily going to happen. But you need to focus on essentially the state needs to get better at doing what the state needs to do in order to counter insurgency in a way that does not alienate a large portion of the population. And you also need to focus on the underlying grievances that exist within the north of Nigeria. And so that type of assessment would be used to then focus on what the tactics should be to counter it.
I'm interested in that point because it kind of leads to your third point about the clarity across the U.S. government.
Yeah.
Where is it deterring or defeating? But in a way, it's always both, right? And just as you were saying with the government, Nigeria needs to have kind of a two-pronged attack or a tactic or strategies. I think that's where the U.S. government, I don't know if you're talking about a specific region, but I think when we're talking across the interagency, we really are looking at kind of what our specific strengths and what we call in our lane, right? What is our lane? So USAID is never going to do the defeat side, right? We're all on the deterrent side, whereas other parts of the government are more on that. And so I think, although far from perfect, that we have really worked to do, there's no one just answer in many places. We have to do both or 3 or 5 things. And so, well, it might look unclear to the outside. I think we have worked very hard to try to figure out what our own specific roles are and implement.
Yeah, absolutely. I do completely agree with that. I think that sometimes messaging is complicated, and that's obviously just extremely surface level of what's going on. At the same time, I think that you have contextual realities which are extremely sensitive. So if you have sort of if you have a partnership that is supposed to focus on all of North and West Africa, and you want it to say be a regional partnership, what does that mean in practice? It means bilateral negotiations between the U.S., perhaps, and the national government. And so you end up with sort of a series of different partnerships when in reality it's a regional problem, right? And so that comes with a whole set of complex issues when you're actually trying to have a consistent messaging across the topic. And I also just want to say that I completely agree that you need the two-pronged approach. And I think that now with Boko Haram in particular, there's an opportunity because Buhari has said that Boko Haram is technically defeated. What does that mean? Well, it means that they're no longer capable of, perhaps, if you believe it, they're no longer capable of say, holding on to territory, conducting large-scale attacks, even though obviously with a suicide bomber in a market, it could be large-scale with very little resources. But technically defeated, they're at a low point. So what does that mean? I mean, ideally, according to this two-pronged system, now they should focus on the underlying grievances that led to this insurgency in the first place. Is that happening? I don't know, but yeah.
Okay, I'd like to continue right on this, but let's take 5 minutes